It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Hunter Clarke-Fields, and we're going to be discussing her new book, Raising Good Humans, a mindful guide to breaking the cycle of reactive parenting and raising kind, confident kids. Hunter, it is truly an honor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, this is the first time you and I are meeting today. I know you're going to be brand new to a bunch of my viewers and listeners. So let's kick off our conversation by having you share a bit of the Hunter Clark Fields origin story. Tell us about your superpowers, your special abilities, whatever it is we need to know. Share that with us now.
Sure. Okay. I think that my special abilities is that I'm very like honest. Like I can't like I'm very like I tell it as it is, I suppose. Um, I don't know. I live in a small state. I've been a painter at different points in my life and created wild, crazy paintings about pregnant beast women and yeah, I grew up in the smallest state, and then now I live in the second smallest state. So I'm moving up in the world very slowly.
And in terms of the themes for your book, like how did you develop a passion or an expertise in parenting? Where did that come from?
Sure. I mean, so, the real backstory is with, me growing up, I was always this really highly sensitive kid. Um, I remember, I would just have these like big ups and downs emotionally all the time. And I remember, kind of like I remember my dad rubbing my back after crying sometime when I was like 11 and him saying, Hunter, this is just your artistic nature and life is going to always be this way. And I was like, oh, like, thanks. It's just not that reassuring, Dad. But he was right. And I really was, I inherited that nature from him. And so I started learning about mindfulness as a teenager, kind of really wanting some relief. And then 10 years later, lo and behold, I found out it worked a whole lot better to actually do the practices rather than just read about them. And 10 years later, when I was 27, I started my first, like, really finally sat down and did my first meditation practice. And I remember I did it for a few months. And I remember thinking, gosh, I'm like, nothing's happening here. I'm just sitting here thinking the whole time. But I looked back at my life during that time and I realized that actually a really big thing had changed, that these pits that I had fallen into for 27 years of my life, for like every week or couple weeks, I hadn't fallen into them for those months at all. And so it was it was this big game changer for me as far as like providing me more equanimity. And then so I thought, going into parenting, I thought, well, like I remember like sitting in my meditation group like with my big pregnant belly and thinking like, oh, like yeah, like this is going to be such a peaceful baby. Like we got this, or just it's going to be awesome. And you have 10 kids, so you know what a shock to the system it really is, and how crazy it was. And so for me, my mindfulness practice kind of fell by the wayside as a new mother. And then my daughter turned 2, or about 18 months old. I remember that's when the sort of like talking back and the nose get starting. And this temper came up out of me that was just enormous. Like it was my father's temper. It was the one thing that I didn't want to pass on to my kids, and I could see that I'm scaring her. And so I really had to take this. So my what everything from the book really comes from this. Like now I feel I'm grateful for my temper because it was my teacher, to teach me like, okay, what can I do about this? How can I calm my reactivity? How can I communicate with her in a way so that we have more cooperation? And so it really all comes from like just kind of failing at it, basically.
Well, next, let's get into the story behind the book. As a publishing guy, I'm always curious where a book gets its start. Was it, were people asking you for this? Were these things you talked about on your podcast or when you did teaching or training? Like, where did kind of the culmination of it was time for this book to go out into the world? Where did that come from?
Well, I had started blogging about, that journey I was kind of going on with my own children. And through that time I started coaching and blogging and doing this work. And I started to develop an audience with the podcast and the coaching. And the book really comes out of the mindful parenting course. Like the chapters actually very much align with the modules of the mindful parenting course. And it really comes out of this work of really seeing, like when I was struggling when I was a young parent, I remember hearing these parenting teachers that would have these like great advice, like to say these really wonderful things and respond in these really great ways, which were wonderful. And then I would try to do it, but I would be triggered and I couldn't, like, I was just like, oh, I'm so triggered. I can't do this when I'm so triggered. And so I really had done this deep dive into learning about the brain and understanding that when that stress response is triggered, like, and I'm pointing here to the base of your neck because it really is kind of like from the amygdala in the base of your neck, right? It's where it's that your body's like evolutionary, like, oh my goodness, you're being threatened response. And what happens when that is going off and your children can trigger that response is that it actually bypasses all the like higher order thinking parts of your brain. It bypasses your verbal ability, your empathy, all of these different things. So what I saw was that we needed these skills from the mindfulness world, right? We needed these practices that are really scientifically proven to lower reactivity. We needed to understand where the triggers come from. We need a whole lot of self-compassion and to be able to do all of that stuff before we even got to the communication piece. Like those communication pieces were really good, but we needed all this stuff first. And so what Raising Good Humans does, it brings those together, and I really wanted to bring those two worlds together. Um, as far as the book goes, I wasn't I'm not sure I was planning on writing a book, but I have a friend who is an author. Carla Naumburg wrote Parenting in the Present Moment, other great, amazing books. She's wonderful. We started doing some workshops together and she encouraged me to write a book proposal, and I did, and I submitted it to New Harbinger, and there you go.
The rest is history. Well, Nate, in terms of kind of I would say reactive parenting to some degree, if you go out in society, it feels like it's almost epidemic that reactive parenting right now. But is part of it that there's just so many of us we're ground down so thin, and there's a lack of self care in so many of our lives that there's just no margin left for us to even not just be triggered all the time every time our kids ask for something.
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, for sure. We're kind of taught in a weird way to not value ourselves, that like taking care of ourselves is selfish. And, we should always put others' needs first. And that's really kind of a detrimental idea. Like there's obviously a balance in all things, but when we're if we're always giving to others and we're never like taking care of our own needs, it just leads to burnout, right? And then everybody's miserable. Then you're snapping and miserable, and everybody's miserable, right? So it really, like, we have to give to ourselves what we want to give to our children. It's kind of interesting. Like when I teach people in mindful parenting, this idea of like others people's needs are more important is so pervasive that I encourage people sometimes to use that as their motivation. Like if you want to, if you want to give your children the best of you, then that can be your motivation to take care of yourself in a really deep and meaningful way, and to take care of your own needs. I mean, especially women, of course, are taught not to take care of our own needs, and it really leads to it just leads to disconnection, and it leads to, our kids are kind of terrible at learning to do what we say, but they're really good at doing what we do and like mimicking our lives. So we learn that, right? Like we pass that on. Like you may think like, oh, it's all about my child. I want to put them first. I'm going to love my child, even if I don't like myself very much. But they hear your inner voice. Like they absorb that. They learn from who you are. And so one of the best things you can do is just to transform yourself and then be that person, be who you want your kids to be.
Yeah, the idea that things are often caught more than they're taught is Very true and legitimate. After 10
I like
kids who, some of who are adults now, it's kind of scary sometimes, like, "Oh, wow, that's just like that's exactly what I do." But in terms of, kinda, parenting patterns and cycles, I feel like we bring stuff forward, some of it helpful, some of it harmful. I know every parent has a moment where they're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm just like my mom," or "I'm just like my dad," where they're like, especially, I feel like we often see it in those bad moments where we react in the way we said we were never going to be with our kids. But there's those triggers, those things that bypass us. In terms of, I guess, being self-aware that those sorts of things are happening and trying to connect that to the mindfulness practice. When we realize we have those sorts of things that are coming up, how do we effectively deal with those so they're less of an issue in our parenting journey?
it's important that we do deal with them. I mean, we want to just like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to look at that. But that's what we talk about. I talk about in chapter 2 is like starting to kind of dig in and understand your own how you were parented, what seeds were planted in you for better or worse. It's not your fault, and just trying to understand that and then say, sometimes like what can happen is like I had a mindful parenting student say to me like, "Oh, I discovered that the orange juice spilling on the floor was driving me insane, way outsized from what was actually happening because she was taught from such a young age about everything being perfect and like appearances and having her house be dirty was like it was felt very shameful. And so she had to kind of dig into that and uncover that to be able to say, "Oh, okay, like this is here. I've got this going on here. This has nothing to do with my child and the orange juice. Like this is my stuff. So how can I start to like heal my stuff?" Mindfulness practice, mindfulness is the sort of a practice of putting our attention intentionally in the present moment with an attitude of kindness and curiosity, right? So we sit and we put our attention on the sounds or the feeling of breath and things like that. And then what happens in those moments is that it's not like you're like sitting there and like sparkles like rain out of your ears and you're just like rainbows out
Rainbows,
of your eyes.
unicorns come
Yeah,
into the room. It's amazing.
no, no, like actually a whole bunch of like normal stuff comes up. Like thoughts come up with trigger feelings and anxieties and all kinds of stuff happens. And but what you're simply practicing in that moment is to be non-reactive to them. So you're practicing to be the observer of them. And normally we're kind of like on autopilot, like those things are just triggering us to act and move and go and do and blah, blah, blah. And we're always kind of future pacing. And so as we sit still with all of those, the different things that arise, and we keep bringing our attention back to the present moment, we don't follow that path, and start doing all kinds of things, but we practice being non-reactive. That helps to it's like a muscle that you really strengthen, and it literally changes the shape of your brain, but it helps us to be non-react it helps us to not react to those triggers and say, "Oh, be the observer. This is what's happening for me right now. I don't have to react to it. These are just sensations in my body. I don't have to be afraid of them. I can sit with them." And it gives us that it's a really powerful ability. It's like that Viktor Frankl quote, like the space between stimulus and response is where our freedom lies. I'm paraphrasing, but that it gives us that, which is really cool.
Yes, that little bit of extra margin or space between the trigger and how we handle the trigger. That's an important in between to handle well. In terms of skillful communication, what how might that look different depending on the age of our kids? How I communicate with a toddler is going to be different than an elementary age kid or a junior high kid or a young adult. So how does skillful communication maybe look the same and a little bit different across the various age ranges?
It's a good question. It's interesting because what I teach in mindful parenting are these universal principles, and they work with like toddlers and they work with older kids, which is neat. So if you think about, so some of the ways we communicate with kids that are unskillful are that we like dismiss their feelings, or sometimes we're blaming or ordering and threatening and things like that. So, for instance, like dismissing. So, a lot of times a toddler will come up, "Ow, I fell on the playground. Ow, ow, ow." And we say, "Oh, you're fine. You're okay. Keep going," because we know they're going to be fine. But unfortunately, it's actually dismissing it's dismissing what's real to them and what's a real feeling for them. So if instead we can say, "Oh, ow, I bet that hurt." A lot of times what'll happen is the child will be like, "Yeah," and be like, boom, 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 like running away, right? Whereas if we dismissed it, they're going to be like, "No, but it really, really hurts. Look how much it hurts. Ow," So if we can actually just kind of really listen and re- honor what they're feeling, reflect back what they're feeling, that can be a lot more, that's a lot more skillful than dismissing those feelings, which is just kind of a normal habitual thing that we do kind of in our culture. And so it's similar, as the same thing might happen like with your 21-year-old, right? Like, oh, I, I'm really worried about taking this COVID test tomorrow, like the nose thing. Oh, it's like so it's freaking me out. And you might suppose some of us might say, like, oh, you're fine. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. It'll be over real quick, right? Like we want to just kind of fix the problem. But if we say, yeah, I know that can be scary, like thinking about that, just a little empathy can go a long way to just being like, thank you, feeling that feeling of being seen and heard. So it can and really apply to any age.
Next, I'd love to have you talk about kind of the difference between and why it's better to often act as a helper rather than a problem solver. And I was thinking about that. My wife naturally is a helper, and I'm naturally a problem solver. So when we're dealing with kids' issues, I want to pull on the problem solver kind of strength, and she wants to always be that helper. So why does the helper sometimes work out better than the problem solver?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. And you're not alone. Lots of people are the problem solver. It's very, very natural. And it's interesting because actually what I want to point your attention to is like how it goes back to how comfortable we are with difficult feelings. Most of us were taught to not have, you know, any kind of feeling that's unpleasant, like sadness or fear or anxiety or whatever, what have you. We're taught to just like stuff that down. So that's not that helpful because then it just like comes out in some other way. But our discomfort leads us to say, like, oh, let's just fix that problem and not acknowledge that this difficulty is here. Right. So I think that's important to say. When our kids come to us with a problem, it's really tempting to like kind of solve it, but also we want to remember that sometimes if we solve their problems, it's kind of like a vote of no confidence in them solving their own problems. And this is kind of where when we think of the extreme of this is like the snowplow parent who's like cleared the way and there are no problems for their child. And so then they get to college and they're like a fragile little teacup that can't handle the world because they've had no problems to be able to handle. So it's really helpful to think about like whose problem is it? If your child has a problem, like they're having difficulty with their homework or whatnot, that's does if it doesn't impinge on your needs and in the household, then it's probably not your problem. So then you can think of it like you said your wife thinks about it like as a helper or like a coach. And going back to, the best way to be a helper in a lot of most times is really to be present, to attend, right? To give that person our full attention. So if I come to you, Sean, and I've got a problem, like, oh my gosh, like this thing is happening, that feeling that the ability to really listen and say, oh, like this is what's going reflect back what's happening for somebody else provides a lot of clarity. It helps other people to process what's going on. um, and it helps them to ultimately solve their own problem. And I think that's just freeing for us as parents because we don't have to solve all our kids' problems. We don't have to be the all-knowing parent. We can just be, authentically human, and that's great. That's just good enough, right?
Yeah, it's kind of that phenomenon often when you talk to somebody else about a problem and you feel seen and heard, the problem magically seems to solve itself all of a sudden in that moment. And so sometimes just that validation that it's real and what you're feeling is true can be enough
Mhm.
to get you out of that stalled spot to actually move forward and take care of the problem. And I like what you said in terms of making sure we're helping our children to be able to make decisions because there's nothing worse than young adults who've not really had the privilege or the opportunity to make a lot of decisions. Because, man, once you get out in the world and college and a job and all the things, you have endless decisions to make. And if you've never had to like start navigate simple decisions in a safe environment, it's a lot more complicated to have to make all of these decisions out in the world. And so, yeah, definitely helping our kids to make those decisions throughout the parenting journey is very important. One of the things I was excited to really have you talk about today was uh, dealing with like highly sensitive or like very emotional children. Like with the 10 kids, I have two that are just very deep feelers, very emotional, and parenting those children is very different than some of the other children in our household. So, on the one hand, you said you were a very deep feeling child. So, how do we effectively model managing dealing with strong feelings and emotions as parents in a way that can kind of help and empower our deep feeling children? Because it's just different than parenting children who are not like that.
Yeah, it's important that we get those lessons, right? Like these are like the most important lessons we can get. Modeling, you said the word modeling. It comes back to that in so many ways. Like it really helps, just like you've heard the advice, like um to hear your kids hear the end of an argument where you and your partner resolve an argument, right? Like to hear actually have let them hear that part. It's also helpful to let them see when you're feeling frustrated and how you resolve those feelings. Like sometimes people want to, they want to be calm, they want to be that calm, accepting parent. And so then they're like, I'm calm, I'm calm, I'm calm, I'm calm, I'm calm. I'm not closing it. You're driving me crazy, right? So instead, one of the things we can do to model that is to start to like use that Dan Siegel, the Dr. Dan Siegel calls it name it to tame it. Use that ability to just acknowledge what's happening in reality in the present moment right now and do it out loud. Like, I'm starting to feel frustrated right now. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a few breaths. I'm going to like sigh it out. Just let them see you process things. Let them see you do some of those things. So I think it's a combination of that and also talking about our feelings and a little bit of like direct instruction on some care and keeping of you can be really helpful. My oldest daughter, she was really highly sensitive, a lot more so as a younger person. And so and she's like a really precocious kid, like really smart and go getting and all this stuff. And so I said to her at one point, we were walking along, I said, there are flowers, like there's a bunch of dandelions, like there's so many beautiful dandelions and they grow anywhere in so many different conditions and they just can grow and bloom and be great. And there are other different differences where some people are like an orchid and you're kind of like an orchid, and orchid needs like specialized conditions to like grow and to actually bloom. Like it actually needs like a lot of care and some specialized conditions, and you're kind of like that. Like you need your whole night's sleep to be able to take care of. So we've had some direct lessons in a non-problem zone about kind of the care and keeping of you. And I think it's helpful sometimes to explain to our highly sensitive kids that, yeah, like sometimes you feel things a lot more than others, and this is how that can be such a gift, and it can be really really hard sometimes, and just offer them that empathy is really important.
Another thing I'd love to have you weigh in on is how do we effectively create and maintain a peaceful environment in our home? I think for a lot of us, having a peaceful home life was challenging in 2020. It'll probably be challenging as we step into 2021. A lot of it because simply the situation has changed so much. You're having families who were together more last year than they were together for the past decade of their
Oh my
family life. And so the circumstances changed dramatically, but at kind of the overarching macro level, tips for maintaining a peaceful home.
I think one of the things that helped in 2020 is its own unique flower. But one of the things that helped in 2020 was a little bit of a lessening of the schedule. That can help. One of the things I think that is, let's go back, take a step back and say the one of the things that helps a peaceful home in general is simplifying things. So simplifying our schedules, simplifying our stuff, simplifying our media, all of these things can really help to create an environment that's less stressful for kids. like too much stuff. I mean, actually in the brain, it's really interesting that if we see a whole bunch of mess, our brains sort of like process it as like still work to do. So it doesn't like let us relax as adults. But for kids, it actually provides a lot of stress for them too, because there's too much to take care of and to handle. So simplifying our stuff and our schedules, that can really, really help. We don't want to be kind of like, and this is like a North Star thing. So if you have a very busy schedule and a very full house of lots of things, and that's fine. Like, I'm not judging you, but the idea is like, when you have a choice point, it can be helpful to start to simplify it, to start to like not have back-to-back events, start to allow some space, allow some breathing room. That is really, really, really helpful. Make sure everything in your home has a place, so care and keeping of your stuff is not overwhelming for you and everybody. That it makes such a big difference. There's a Kim Payne, who wrote Simplicity Parenting, he did some studies with this, so with ADHD kids, and went through a simplification regime with them and saw a big like lowering of their symptoms. And so it can really reduce kind of the stress. I think our environment matters a lot. So I talk about simplifying there, and then I also talk about just, I think this is a great place to like put in some information about gratitude and just the power of that, and making a practice of that and making it part of your home environment with like a simple practice like what are you grateful for? What are three things you're grateful for today, honey? At the end of the day, and it just makes like a whole um it makes like a just complete change. We're going to have an interruption here. Hi Maggie, I'm on a podcast right now. Can you step out, please? Sorry, honey. We're keeping it real, folks.
That's right. No,
Can see her striding purposely over.
I have two locked doors behind me to keep, half naked toddlers or whatever might come through the door in my house. So no worries. So, whatever you want to wrap up about peaceful home, finish that thought.
Sure. Yeah. So I just invite people to, I know like changing your home environment can, that's like a big can of worms, but I just invite people to kind of consider that it can add a lot of ease to simplify things in your home.
Right. And like anything, you eat the elephant one bite at a time. So if there's clutter, declutter. If there's, things that maybe you shouldn't let your kids watch because it's too disturbing for some of them and it gets them all angsty, change the channel, if you will. I like the practice of at the end of the day, asking your kids, or at the dinner table might even be better, what they're grateful for their day. It can be simple things, it can be minor changes, but those small changes over time really scale up to something significant in terms of the environment and the feeling in your home. In terms of the reader's journey with the book, they get to that last page, they close that back flap. How do you hope you've impacted their relationship with their kids? What do you want to look different on that side of the journey with your book?
Well, I want them to, I'm hoping at this by then, I mean, people can dive in as deeply or as they want to, but I'm hoping by then you're going to start to shift the way you're thinking about things, like shifting the way we think about ourselves, offering ourselves a lot more compassion because it's not easy, but then also understanding that there are paths and there are ways and there are practices and there's support you can get to it's doable to calm our reactivity, to steady the heart and the mind, to be more present for our kids. And then also when we think about our kids and our parenting, to start to realize that you know our conflicts are just people trying to get their needs met, and we can start to look at how we meet how we meet each other's needs, and start to shift from kind of like that top down approach to more of like, let's just figure out what everybody's needs are and start to like build that communication where we're all taking each other into account. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping for, and a little insight into your child, a little insight into yourself, and a lot of compassion, a lot of and I really hope to give people a sense that like your temper, your difficulties, the struggles that you're having, they're not your fault. They're not like an indictment of your character. They're not like something you chose. Like people think that like if I'm yelling at my child, I'm a terrible person, but you didn't choose to yell at your child. You weren't like, excuse me, I would like to yell at Maggie at like 2 o'clock today. No, like that didn't happen. So you just to understand like we have these responses and there are steps that we can take and we can take care of them and shift them bit by bit.
And I like what you said about getting away from that top-down approach in terms of, I always feel it's more of a kind of a getting down at the child's level to be in their life, where you're listening, you're in their space. I find like at least for me as a dad, that's the best way for me to understand what's going on, as opposed to if I'm always trying to parent just at like the 10,000 foot level. It's effective some of the time, but often it's not super helpful. So I guess I'll try to continue learning to be more of that helper at the ground level rather than the you know problem solver up higher, if you will. Anytime I have somebody on the show who has a podcast, I always like to make sure we talk about that. So if the listeners head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and they subscribe to the Mindful Mama podcast, what can they expect to encounter there?
We have mostly interviews, some like on air coaching calls. We've had great guests. Dan Siegel's been on a couple times, Sharon Salzberg, Tina Payne Bryson, all kinds of wonderful people coming on and sharing anything about mindfulness and parenting that I like to follow. On the shiny objects I like to follow.
Well, and that is the dirty little secret of most of us podcasters. We actually like to interview interesting guests because we learn and we're stretched and we get to grow in the process. So, just like it creates valuable content for our listeners and our viewers, it creates valuable content for us to consume and learn from in the moment as well. Hunter, for the listeners and viewers who'd like to connect with you, find out more about the book, your podcast, everything you have going on, where can we discover you on the web?
You can go to mindfulmamamentor.com. You'll find, you can get book bonuses there when you buy the book, and the podcast and information to work with me further on there too.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places you can connect with Hunter and pick up your very own copy of her new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Hunter Clarke-Fields. Once again, our book today was Raising Good Humans, a mindful guide to breaking the cycle of reactive parenting and raising kind, confident kids. Again, if you want to connect with Hunter and find out more, a great place to start is her website. You can find that over at mindfulmamamentor.com. And Hunter, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.